Judge! Wow, cool. Alright, so it's 3 o'clock. We're here for You Want to Be a Team Leader with CJ Stambaugh. So I'll let him take it away.
So, you want to be a team leader?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Hello, my name is, as it says on here, CJ Stambaugh, level 2 from New Britain, Connecticut. For any of you who don't know where New Britain, Connecticut is, it's Hartford. It's just Hartford. It's either Hartford or New Haven, so we'll pick one. It's Hartford in this case.
What makes New Britain different from Old Britain?
It's newer.
And by default better.
And by default better. There we go. All right. So before we get started, we're gonna have a little overview. But just want to ask a quick question: how many of you here have actually team led at any event? Any event? So most people. Good. That's great.
Does running in more than one good PPT count?
Yeah. If you've been considered a team lead at an event, any advice, we're going to be having some open discussion sections. Any advice that you might have on things that you've done that have been good or things that you've done that have not worked out, it's going to be great. We're gonna want that when we get to those sections. So, it's a little overview to get us started. We have to go over what is a team. In this case, this is going to be going over what I am considering a team lead for the most general advice. Because obviously team leading is a large thing. Like there are many things. Sometimes you're a team of 1, sometimes you're a team of 2. You know, if you end up getting into level 3 and you team lead at a GP, or even if you team lead on day 2 of a GP, you can have up to 5 people under you. There's a lot of different situations where you can be a team lead. There's team lead on size, team leads for all kinds of different things. But we're going to go over what kind of definition I'm giving most of this general advice for. And we will be touching on the situations, the other situations as well. But we will define that when we get to there. Then qualities of a great team lead. This is kind of the stuff that you want to focus on doing to excel at team leading. If it's your first time team leading, we'll go over a little bit of that when we get into the section of what your role is as a team lead, which is part of the what is a team lead section. But for the most part, when we get to this part, this is like good things that people have seen while team leading specifically. I'm going to lead off with some stuff, and then we're going to have an open discussion on good things with team leading. After that, things to avoid while you're team leading. There are certain things that don't generally work out well that I've seen. People are going to have differing opinions on this, but this is just general stuff that I've noticed that has not worked out or that other people have told me about that has not worked out. And then another open discussion again to kind of get ideas from everybody because my opinions are not law, but that's why we have everybody here. So we're going to have a little wrap-up. All right, so to start off with a little disclaimer. As I've said, these are all opinions. None of the things that I'm going over today are fact. None of these things are all of these things you have to do in order to be a team lead. This is all stuff that I have gathered as information and I'm providing to you as a resource. It's not something that you need to feel you need to follow, but it is something that has worked out well for me or for others in the past. Every person's going to have a different style. I generally prefer a more open, friendly kind of team lead experience. Some people might prefer a more growth-focused experience. Some people might just prefer to get the job done. Everybody's going to have a different thing, but the important thing is to do what works for you. Okay? If you have something to offer, that's great. Some of it is not going to work for everybody in this room. And some of the stuff that even I offer here is not going to work for everybody in this room. And there's a lot of stuff on this list that's very simple to implement, and there's a lot of stuff that may not be easy. Those are two different things. If you have seen any of my other presentations, I always like to go over this distinction, because a lot of these statements are just like, bam, this thing. It's a very simple concept, but that does not mean that it is easy to implement. Okay? There's a very simple versus easy, and complicated versus difficult are two separate things. I just want to make sure that a lot of this stuff may not be very complicated, so it could be simple, but it may be very difficult to start or to implement. And then a lot of this advice does come from feedback and experience. So if you have any feedback, if you have experiences that have worked, that's what we're kind of focusing on here. If you would like to talk to me about specific stories or specific situations where you did specific things are working or not working. I prefer to hold those until the end of the discussion, whether the open discussions are more for the points that we want to hit on generally, and then we can discuss stories possibly at the end. All right, so for the purposes of this presentation, what is a team lead? Team leads are generally in mid to large size events, so we're talking about probably a staff of 10, anywhere from 10 judges up to like GPs. Maybe we have 25, 30, more than that judges on staff. You could have teams of 2, 3, 4, 5, larger numbers. SCG Classic Series, SCG Opens, sides at GPs is another big one. Generally, you'll be in charge of a specific subset of tasks. For the small, like the more to the mid-sized events, you'll generally have deck checks and not deck checks, just because there's not enough people to make teams for paper and pairings and slips and all these things. But you can also have, the sides teams at GPs will have, ODEs versus Swiss sides versus, they might have an entire team dedicated to deck checks for the last chance qualifiers. There's a bunch of different things, but some of the examples I have on here, like a paper pairings or slips teams and a breaks team. So, team generally has 3 or more judges for the these types of events, the SCG Classics, Opens, and Sides of GPs. For the smaller events, a lot of this advice doesn't really apply that well, just because if you're only interacting with one person, it's hard to have something like team unity, because it's you and one other person. You're kind of just a unit that is doing a task. You happen to be in charge of that unit, so some of this does apply, but most of this advice is going to be for if a team has 3 or more judges. All right, so what is your role as a team? Can anybody give me some things that might be what you think? When I say, what is your role as a team lead, what does that mean to you?
Making sure everyone gets water and breaks.
Making sure everyone gets water and breaks.
You are assigned a specific set of tasks, and it is your responsibility to get those tasks done, and the judges with you are some of the resources you have to help get those tasks done.
Okay, that's great. Getting tasks done.
You're the liaison between the team members and either the organizer or the head judge.
Okay.
Your team is there to help make the event go well. You're there to help your team have a good event.
Okay, so we've got having your team perform well at the event. We've got, I'm sorry, parents, remind me again.
You're the liaison between your team and also the organizer or the head judge.
Yeah, so you're the liaison, kind of, you go between the different entities of the event, making sure that everybody has the correct information.
So this is secondary, but you are also often responsible for approving backups and game losses.
There are some things that are specifically delegated to team leads, and you'll be in charge of those tasks as well, such as backups or game losses.
Making sure you're able to get like the less experienced members of your team experience and the things you want to grow on and pairing with more experienced judges.
Yeah, so in charge of facilitating growth in some way.
To a certain degree, like competing and networking, like especially with newer judges, it's like not making sure they're not forgotten, being like, hey guys, like let's get to know one another. Let's make sure that Manny actually gets to know Nate, and they don't just leave the event being like, yeah, I worked with him once.
Yep, sure. So networking the people on your team together, manage your.
I was going to just elaborate a little on what Terrence said about being the liaison. You represent to the head judge what is going on with the task you're responsible for. So if the head judge needs to know where deck checks are, you are the one who needs to have that answer for them.
Yes, cool. So yeah, that hit on a lot of the points that I'm going to hit on, but I'm just going to go over some of I have a good, better, best kind of hierarchy here. This does not mean that this is how you will be viewed in the whole of the community, but generally, a good team lead will get the team's task done, as I believe Olivier said. So getting the team's task done means many things, but one of the most important things is know what your team is responsible for. That is a very important point that I don't think enough people hit on when they're first team leading, is they just go in like, hey, I'm paper, that means I'm in charge of paper. That's most of the time the case. Sometimes you're also in charge of something else. Sometimes you're just in charge of a specific set of paper. Sometimes you're in charge of just pairings. Sometimes you're in charge of just slips. that is a possibility, and knowing what your responsibilities are is your job as a team. Also, knowing when the breaks are, specifically because you need to know when you need to give up responsibility to somebody else or take on responsibility from somebody else. That is also very important, and again, something that I noticed that's overlooked amongst newer team leads. I ask a lot of questions of my team lead when we're going on break. So, hey, who's handling the clock this round? They just kind of stare at me. They're like, oh yeah. I'm like, I'm sure it's fine. I made sure somebody was on that before, right? Like, it's especially when it's a specific team member's task, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about delegation later. But knowing when those responsibilities are going to be taken on or put on somebody else is also very important. And your responsibilities can change throughout the day, especially on side events. Side events is a big place where this happens. Sometimes you'll get a bunch of judges from somewhere, and you'll need to put them somewhere. Maybe people need to start cleaning up. Maybe people need to start doing something that's not normally part of a regular event. And knowing when communicating with whoever's in charge, as Terrence and Manny said, is very, very important to know when those responsibilities change and how they have changed and how you're going to handle that. So moving on from there, a great team lead is a conduit of information, as Terrence said. Knowing what information, when the head judge needs to communicate to the floor judges, you're that conduit of information. The head judge is going to say to you as a team lead, hey, tell the floor judges X. Then you go to the floor judges and tell them X. Sometimes they'll tell you to spread it as fast as you can to just kind of get it amongst the floor. But most of the time, they'll tell you, hey, tell your team this. Another way is when another team lead needs to communicate to your judges. Sometimes, it'll go from person to person, but most of the time, the team lead is a very focal point to get that information disseminated amongst the floor from another team lead. And, as we've said, when a floor judge needs to communicate to the head judge or possibly even another team lead. Right? This is something that is missed a lot. The other two are fairly inherent in how a team lead structure works because it goes, head judge, team lead, floor judge. But this is just as important, if not more important, because if the head judge does not know what's going on the floor, then that can create an incomplete picture, and then that's how things get missed. It's not necessarily oversight on specifically the head judge's part, but sometimes there is information that is out there that needs to go back up the chain, and that is also very important. So being a conduit of information is how to be a great team lead. How to be an even better team lead, as somebody mentioned, I forget who it was, facilitating growth, which is fantastic. And again, this is whenever possible. This is not something that can always be done, especially on events that are very quick, like very fast-paced, but it is something that very minor things can contribute to, and it's always something that you should keep an eye out for. The team lead is in the best position at an event to give feedback. You're in the best position to give feedback to your head judge. You're in the best position to give feedback to your floor judges. You're in the best position to give feedback to your other team leads because you are this conduit of information. People are going to come to you and say, hey, I noticed floor judge did this. I don't agree with this for these reasons. Or I noticed that this person had responsibilities but didn't follow through with them. Or, hey, I noticed this person is doing great. They will come to team leads to tell that information. And you're in a very unique position because that's just inherent within the position. That's just something that people do because not necessarily everybody's going to go to the head judge because, the head judge might be busy, they might be on an appeal, we might get interrupted, something like that. And team leads are generally available because that's part of their role. Providing feedback. Because you have all this information, you're in a unique position where you're available to be able to provide that feedback when it's necessary. Sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes it's like, hey, this behavior can't happen, or hey, I saw you did that. That's great. Sometimes it's at the end of an event, like, hey, I noticed over the course of the day this and this and this. I would really prefer this, or that's great. Continue that. Providing feedback is something that is going to help everybody on your team facilitate growth. And there's a few different types of growth that you can focus on. as you get more experience in team leading in general, team growth is generally something that you want to focus on, just because there is a certain point at a certain event where you're the most experienced person on the team. That's not always going to be the case, but you can use that experience to help your team grow in whatever way is good for them. Sometimes it'll be rules knowledge, especially at some of the SCG Opens, you'll get newer L1s, or some of the day 2, the SCG Classics, you'll get newer L1s, or even newer L2s that might not be knowledgeable in certain parts of rules, policy, tournament logistics, something. And using your knowledge and experience to help your team grow can be very valuable. There's also self-growth. I've been on many teams where I was the least experienced person, and I was a team lead. That happens sometimes. And recognizing those situations and being able to get information from the people that are on your team is very, very valuable. I use those events to grow the most myself. And you can also use that to help your team grow in the area of mentorship. Right? There's a lot of different ways that you can leverage being in this unique position for observation to help you give and get feedback. And providing and facilitating growth is one of the best things that you can do in the team position. And finally, just have fun. I mean, we all have fun at events. We've all had a lot of fun at events. We wouldn't judge unless we were having fun in some capacity, right? But as a team lead, you can really set the pace for the day. And you can set it in a good way, you can set it in a negative way. I always like to start off the day by having something exciting, like, hey guys, we're here to do this, it's going to be great, everything's going to be awesome, and then you can go from there. Sometimes you can have a more laid back approach, like, hey guys, we're just here to have fun, we're just here to do this. You can kind of do it in whatever way you would frame it normally, but having fun is something that you can really do, and a couple of ways that you can do that is providing activities while on the floor. A lot of the higher level judges have been pushing the watch magic way of doing things. I'm sure that some of you may have seen, if you were at DC a couple weeks ago, there was several watch magic teams, and a lot of those teams had activities like, hey, find the biggest life total. Hey, find the best play that you see today. Find the worst misplay that you've seen today. Chris, did you have something? And providing those activities can help people have fun. People have fun in different ways. Some people are just there to work. That's fine. But if you want to provide these activities, that is great. Some people, if they don't want to do those activities, you can just engage in discussion. Obviously, making sure that the first thing you remember from the other slide, that making sure your team's tasks are getting done is very important. But you can have discussions while you're doing that. You can have discussions during downtime, in between rounds, or you can have discussions on break. And encouraging those discussions and engaging in those discussions is very important. And getting to know your team. Like Steve said, getting to know your team and making sure that you know how everybody is going to best facilitate doing your tasks and having fun and everything like that is very important. And getting your team to know each other. Good technique for doing this is pairing people off at the beginning of the day. One of the first things that I say is, who doesn't know who, right? So let's say Manny and Steve are on a team, and Manny and Steve have never met each other before. Be like, hey, you know each other? No? Great. You two are paired. You should chat to each other throughout the day. Not only does that get them to know each other, but also if there's kind of a blank slate for feedback, that can work out very, very well. A lot of the problems that I find for getting and giving feedback is if you're very familiar with somebody, you're just like, oh, that's just Zach. Zach does things, or Zach does this thing great. He always does this thing great. He knows he does this thing great.
It's true.
It's true. See, even Zach knows. But pairing people together that have not necessarily worked together can be very, very powerful for getting feedback. So, we've gone over what a team lead is and the definition of what kind of universe we're working in, and what the general role of a team lead is. Let's talk about some qualities of great team leads. And one of the most important ones that I still don't do a lot is taking notes. So, what taking notes can do is it can provide accurate answers quickly. When you are a conduit of such the amount of information that you get when you're a team lead, you get your team's responsibilities, the responsibilities of the other team, you get break schedules, you get when responsibilities change, you get who's doing what on your team, you get feedback from people on your team about you, you get feedback from your team about other people. There's all of this information, and taking notes is something that I don't see anybody doing. And like I said, that includes me. But taking notes is something that when somebody has a question as a team lead, unless it's actually the head judge's responsibility, you should have an answer for that question. And not having the answer or not having the answer is acceptable only if you know who does have that answer. You want everything to be a minimum of 2 steps when you're a team. You know, if somebody says, hey, when is this other team going on break? You should have the break schedule in some capacity so that you know when that team's going on break, because they need that information right then and there. Taking notes can help you do that. It's much easier to give feedback in this way. Again, growth is a large part of the team lead position. You're in a very good position to be able to give feedback, and writing things down is a great way to do that. It's it's easier to give feedback. It's also easier to get feedback. If somebody says, "Hey, you did this thing. Don't do that thing," or "I would prefer that it be done this way," if it's in the case of the head judge, or if a floor judge says, "Hey, you said this thing. I really think that it should be done this way," and they're making a very good point. Writing that down, especially so that you can enact that as immediately as possible, is always good. And getting feedback when you're in a position where you can grow a lot is very, very good. And tasks and responsibilities tend to be forgotten less. This is specifically in cases where your responsibilities may change, or in the case of the break schedule, responsibilities that you only have for a short period of time. And taking notes can significantly reduce the chances of that happening. Yes.
So yeah, taking notes is awesome. I think everyone should do it all the time if they can. Probably not while they're taking a call.
Yes.
But I guess my biggest question is what, as someone who hasn't really, I guess I was responsible for a task at that 5K we did, but I haven't led other people. I'm interested in how the notes that you take as a team leader are different from the notes that you take as a floor judge. Like,
okay.
What is it more just logistically based? Like, how do those notes look different?
Sure. So that's a great question for those of you that may have not heard the whole thing. I'm just going to summarize it. How do the notes that you take as a team lead differ from the notes that you might take as a floor judge? And I would say that it's almost the same thing, except there's just more of it. There are things that you would not have the responsibility for as a floor judge that you will have as a team lead, and those are the things that you need to take notes of.
So it's the same but more.
It is the same but more. There's no specific set of things, like even as a floor judge, I'll take note of the break schedule for the entire team just to know who's doing what. But for the most part, you will need to know, like, I always try to, when I'm team leading, I always try to at least jot down a brief description of what each team does, especially if there's a team that's unfamiliar with me. There have been a lot of differences in team structure, especially going into like higher level team leagues like Grand Prix and stuff like that, where there are judges from different places. That just, like, sometimes there was a team called Stage Team. I didn't know what Stage Team was, and I was on Stage Team. And there was another team led. I team led a Watch Magic team, and I was like, "Is that the same as a floor team?" And he said no, and I was very confused. So I took some notes and kind of got a feel of just a brief description of what each team is supposed to be doing. And that is a good starting point. Then you can go from there. I generally have a page for each team because then I'll take notes. Like, the structure is going to depend on how you best take notes and how you best analyze notes. But for the most part, try to have at least a brief description on anything that could possibly be your responsibilities. Is a good start. Does anybody have any other questions?
What is Stage Team?
The stage team in that case, there was a specific team that was assigned to tasks that came from scorekeepers or from somebody on the stage. to go and like, this match needs to be broken. Stage team, go and do that. They also assisted at end of round. They also sorted slips. It's kind of just weird. Like, it's kind of like everything else. Like how logistics sometimes does everything else, except this was specifically dedicated to tasks focused on the stage.
So stuff that's often critical path where they need someone when they need.
Right, exactly, and that's why I think they tried it out. I don't know that they've done it at many GPs since then, but it seemed to work out at GPs. So yeah, taking notes. Another great quality of a great team lead is team unity. Some of the, I wouldn't say like worst experiences, but some of the more negative experiences that I've had on a team is when I get to the end of a day and I'm just like, man, I didn't really feel like I interacted with anybody. Right? Has anybody ever had that kind of, raise of hands, like where you get to the end of the day, you're like, man, I didn't interact with anybody, I didn't really chat about anything. You have a,
No, I was just
but yeah, like team unity is something that is very, very good to have. Number one, it allows for more opportunities for observation. If two people are on some kind of pair detail, then it's very easy for them to get feedback on each other. If you're constantly interacting with the team in a way that's like you just check up on somebody every once in a while, that's just like, hey, this person's paying attention to me. And maybe you shadow them on a call. Maybe you see something that you can give them feedback. So it's a great opportunity for observation. Your team is more likely to give feedback if they are on a pair. I found that when I have paired people, and I ask, like this is strictly word of mouth. I haven't actually done statistics on this or anything. But when I a question that I typically ask at the end of the event is, do you feel that you have enough for a review on something? And the events where I pair people on a team, it's significantly higher than if I don't. Most people are like, I didn't really feel like I interacted with anybody for enough for a review. I do have some feedback from them. I'm like, great, you should give them that feedback. But generally, reviews will come when people have worked together for a longer time. There is another kind of model where you can pair people, before a certain time period, either by number of rounds, where I generally do it before breaks, after breaks, and then break pairs and pair with other people, just because that kind of spreads the feedback around. But that is going to depend on a lot of different things, such as like, how long is the event? How many people do you have on your team? Is that actually logistically feasible? If it's a really short event, you probably don't want to do something like that because then you run into the problem where people don't get enough feedback. But just making sure that people are interacting enough with each other to give feedback is a very, very good quality. Teams will have more open communication. One of the, you'll see this when I get to the things to avoid later, not communicating is a big, big problem. You don't want to be in a position, like I said, where somebody asks a question and you don't have an answer. Or you don't have that one step where you can go to somebody else and they'll have the answer. When you have more cohesive team and your team gets information from the floor, they can give that information to you, and they're more likely to do that if you're either checking in with them, or they just are familiar enough with you that they say, oh, hey, I should go tell CJ this, or they should go tell May or Dylan or whoever. Having more open communication is always good, and having a sense of team unity can help build that base for communication. Conflicts are less likely to come up and easier to resolve. Conflicts are going to come up occasionally. They're not going to come up at every event, and especially they may not even surface at every event, but they're going to exist at every event. And if you really push the fact that you guys are a team and you're working together, the conflicts that come up not only will come up in a way that's very easy to manage most of the time, but they're also going to be able to resolve pretty easily. And that's resolve as far as make the event work. Not necessarily resolve in finale, but they'll be easier to resolve in a way that will make the event go as smoothly as possible. And that's really the goal. We want the event to be smooth. We want to be able to do all those things that we said beyond just doing your task. We want to make sure that we're generating some feedback. We want to make sure that we are having fun. Okay? So does anybody have any questions on community?
So just like hypothetical situation, you pair two people in a team, and like 2 rounds into the event, they hate each other guts and they can't stand each other. How do you go forward from there, provided that you don't have anyone else to? Do you just switch teams around at that point, or what would you do there?
If it were that bad that somebody would approach me and say, "Hey, I can't work with this other person," and I'd be like, "All right, absolutely. I would." We're going to talk about some techniques to avoid bad things, and one of those techniques is having team meetings or getting together at specific points. So generally, if you have a point where you have a contact with your whole team, which it's not necessary every round unless you're like paper, right? Because then you're just all at the printer anyways to go get the paper. But for teams like floor team or deck checks, where you're all kind of all over the place doing deck checks, or sometimes you're uncovered, where you're literally on opposite sides of everything. It can be more difficult to get that team meeting together, but at that point, I would call a team meeting essentially and say, "Hey, so gotten some feedback. I don't mention anything specific about what happened, but just say like, hey, we're just gonna switch things up. You two are paired, you two are paired, or however you want to do it. Sometimes you can say, hey, maybe instead of this, you two discussing as a pair, you two should discuss as a pair. Another important thing is to not necessarily like super enforce like, hey, you need to do this. Having it as a suggestion so that people can interpret the way that they want will allow people to give and get feedback the way they want, which is it helps the events go a lot smoother. So that was a great question. Any other questions?
You're talking about pairing people up being more likely to give feedback. An interesting thing that I think can also come out of this as a point of growth is like, people often feel like they have to, zone in on someone and observe them throughout a day to be able to get productive feedback. And it's like, okay, well, like you said earlier, you talked to some of your teammates and they're like, well, I don't feel like I have enough for a review, but I have some feedback for you. I'm sitting here like, well, then you have enough for a review, right? It's like, causing a paradigm shift is also something that can come out of this kind of thing, where it's like, you have data that if you find this valuable to this other person, you should interact with them and share it with them, even if it wasn't a quantitative amount that you come up with in your head.
Right.
So.
Yeah, Nate's point is very good. He's basically saying, pairing people can really generate really good feedback, even if they don't think that that's a thing that has happened. And encouraging that and making sure that that's happening is very important.
You mentioned that conflicts are less likely to come up and easier to resolve with more team unity. I can get how they're easier to resolve. Could you explain a little bit more why, for instance, the pairing system means conflicts between team members are less likely to happen?
It's more, not necessarily between the team members themselves, but more like, oh, I thought this person was supposed to be doing this. If you have people in pairs, they might remind each other like, oh, hey, did you go start the clock, or did you go do this? Those kind of conflicts can happen as well, or conflicts with people on other teams. Like let's say, some people are in a pair and are like, oh man, I had a really bad interaction with so, and then they can talk it out with the person on their team. So although they could be more likely to come up theoretically if you pair people specifically, I think that the fact that people kind of have somebody that they can go to is that's not necessarily somebody that's in an authoritative position like a team leader or head judge or something like that, can be it's a lot more of an open environment in that case. And people, I think, are more receptive to that than like, hey, if you have problems, you need to come see me. They have somebody else that they can go to first and be like, hey, this is really something that I think the team lead should address. Or, hey, this is, I think, something that the head judge should address. But having that other person to first bounce ideas off of is, I think, a very good thing to do, which is why I tend to pair people. Anything else? Nope. Good. All right. Cool. So the next quality of a great team lead is delegation. Originally, I had this in the first part of the presentation as part of your role is to delegate, but there are events where you can go to, it's not ingrained in part of your role to delegate your tasks. You can go through a day and do all the tasks for your team, and that's a thing that you can do. If that is how you feel that is the best way for that to be done, then that's fine. You can do that. But I think quality of a great team lead is delegating those tasks. Here's why. It helps you set the expectations for the day. A lot of the conversations that I have with people that have questions about team leading, or a lot of the conversations that I have about, hey, why did you do this when you were team leading, is about setting expectations. Setting expectations is one of the most important things that can change the course of a day. You come into a day and you say, hey guys, so we're going to be doing some stuff or something, I don't know, paper, we might meet at the beginning of the round. I don't know, I haven't figured it out yet. Like, that's very different from, like, if you sit down and say, hey, so this is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be doing paper. That means at the beginning of each round, I want you all to show up at the printer, preferably before the last slip comes in. If you need to go to the bathroom or something, just let me know before that. And that can really set the expectations for what you expect to happen as a team lead, so you can give feedback on that if it's necessary. And also, it's expectations for your floor judges. They know what you expect. It's a very good way, it's a very simple way to make sure that you know that your tasks, you know what the expectation for your tasks getting done are, and they know what they need to be doing when they're on. Another concept that I like to use for delegation is a default status. So default status is your team when, assuming you go off somewhere and you have to talk to the head judge about an investigation or something, that your team will still operate, right? When you're delegating tasks, I just tend to delegate the bigger things at the beginning of the day. Like, let's say we're doing logistics, and logistics in this case is clock, end of round, and floor. I will point to somebody. I will point to Josh and be like, hey, you're doing the clock. Joe, you're going to be on the end of rounds to make sure you come up and get the clipboard at the end of the round. And Adam, you're going to be making sure that floor coverage is good. Okay? Just delegate those big tasks that are part of your team at the beginning of the round, and that can change throughout the day. But making sure that that is the default status and checking in on the default status can make the day go so smooth. So that way, if you're not there, and you know, Josh says, "Oh, the round's starting, but I don't see CJ," better go start the clock, right? You know, that's just something that happens, as opposed to something that you need to check in on every single round. There is a way that you can set a default status with having people change roles, which is also very good. I would not suggest changing them every round, because that can get pretty confusing. But having default status is like, hey, if I'm not around and X do Y, is very good to go over at the beginning of the day. So what this does, or part of what this does, is it makes you available for questions on the floor, just general questions, like Eli said, about specific things that you might be in charge of, like backups or game losses, and also so that you're available for the head judge. I believe Manny said something about the head judge will have specific things that they go to the team about, like, hey, where are we at on deck checks? Especially at the beginning of the day. This is very important. For, like, let's say deck checks, for example. At an event with 300 players, there's going to be 300 deck lists. Turns out we need to organize those and make sure we have all of them, right? So, a common question that you're going to get from your head judge is, hey, what's going on with the deck lists? Do we have all the deck lists? Something to that effect. And if you're not delegating your team to be doing those tasks and you're ingrained in those tasks, sometimes you won't have a handle on it. And that's not a good thing. That's something that you want to avoid. So being available for questions from the head judge or questions from team members is very good, and delegating any task that is not specific to the needs of a team lead is very important. And the team will feel more engaged. You know, this goes back to part of the team unity. If you assign each person a task, I like to give each person on my team one task, even if some of them have a little bit more weight than others. So that way each person on the team feels engaged doing something. For deck checks, it's really easy because you're like, hey, you're in charge of the deck list. Hey, you're in charge of pulling the tables. Hey, you're in charge of getting stuff over to coverage if that's necessary, right? Like, there's a lot of tasks, small tasks that you can delegate to each person on your team. Or you can just open it up and say, like, hey, so I've got this. Who wants to do this? All right, you're doing that. that can help your team be like, hey, I got the thing that I want. That makes me feel good, and that can help engage the team and keep the energy up, especially through long days. I see a lot of yawns and stuff going on right now because I'm sure it has been a long day for a lot of people. But having everybody feel more engaged is really really good and really easy to do with delegation. Anybody have any questions on delegation? Hey.
So at the start of the day, like, what do you think is the best or the most productive way to evaluate your team members for delegation purposes? Right? So at the start of the day, you've got your team. You work with this guy. You know he's the rock star. But these other guys, these are people you've never worked with before. You don't really know the extent of their capabilities. Like, what I don't ever feel like I want to do as a team leader is assume that they don't know what they're doing. Right.
Okay.
But how do you evaluate how competent they are at that time? Assuming you're not in a situation where you can pair them with experienced people in such a way that you can make sure that all the tasks are covered productively. Right. So your team is only 3 or whatever.
Okay.
How do you evaluate that?
Okay. So Nate's question, Jason, I'll come to you in a second. I'm just going to answer Nate's question real quick. So Nate's question was essentially, how do you come to a point where you can delegate tasks to people that you don't know? Or how do you evaluate the best way to delegate some subset of tasks? I find that one of the best ways to do that is to have those open questions, right? Is to ask a question like, hey, so we've got these things. Who wants to do this thing? Or, hey, are you comfortable with doing this? You can ask them directly if they want to do a task. If they kind of say, yeah, and then you can maybe go down a list, like, would you rather do this? Would you rather do this? And you kind of give them some options and kind of gauge from there. Let's go with a quick scenario. Let's say you're team leading at an SEB Classic, right? So this is day 2. You've got 3 people on your team because you're on the largest event there. I think they're generally around 4 people on a team for the largest.
4
4
or 5.
or 5. And they're all relatively inexperienced. Okay, and you don't really know many of them. You can ask somebody that may know them. You can ask another team lead, like, hey, I have these people. Do you know these people? What do you think about delegating these tasks to these people? They may say, oh, I think this person would be good for this task, or I think this, and then you can kind of delegate based on that. If they straight up just don't have the experience, this will generally come up on stuff like side events, where people are like, I've never fired an ODE before. It's like, well, why don't you shadow this person first, and then we'll get you to a point where you're doing that. Being able to delegate tasks to your more experienced team members is good. If nobody has experience, then just kind of do stuff. That might be more of a point where you do less delegation and you do more like showing what to do yourself. But those will generally be in situations where you are less needed as a team. Like you're really just a point of contact. You're one step below, the Swiss sides lead or the or the sides lead in general. And that is more of a point of communication like, hey, how's everything going? Great. Or bad, we need more people, right? Like that's generally the extent of those conversations that you'll have when you have those situations. Because on a focused team, like a paper team or something like that, you're generally going to have at least one other experienced person, and even if you don't, the tasks are fairly simple. So maybe if you can gauge or ask, who's the most experienced with this? Okay, you do this. Gauging that is something that you can do on the spot. But generally, so to summarize, because that was kind of rambly, ask questions, always ask questions, or go with something that you think will work and modify it later. Okay? Modifying it later is always something that you can do, but generally, asking questions is going to be the best way to get the best result. Does anybody have any questions? Great. All right, so one more, I think. Nope. Yes, keeping calm. So, keeping calm is something that can be difficult to do sometimes. It's not something that comes naturally to everybody. A lot of the feedback that I get is, hey, you were calm in this set of circumstances where it was crazy and all this stuff was going on, and that's a lot of the really positive feedback that I got. And one of the main reasons that you want to keep calm is the first thing that the floor judges do, or they generally when something's going wrong. This almost happened on day 2 of GPDC, if anybody was working that event. All right. Okay. So we're gonna speed through that. Or we're gonna speed through this. So
We don't get the GPDC story?
we can get that after because I've got a lot more stuff and there's a lot less discussion that I think is gonna go on. But we have been discussing things kind of along the way, which is good. So we'll tell the GPDC story later. But basically, the floor judges will look to the team lead first, generally, because you're the person that's on the floor there. You're a person that's in an authority position, and if you're going crazy trying to do all these things, people are gonna kind of follow suit. That's because that's the only person that they're looking at, and right now the person that they're looking at is very hectic. So if you keep calm, they will be able to keep calm a little bit better as well. Your move will affect your floor judge. So if at the beginning of the day you're like, hey guys, I just got in, I'm kind of flustered right now, go do this for now, I'll figure everything out. And then you kind of go off, that can kind of set the mood for the day. Also, if you're very low energy, like if it's the third day that you're working, it can be very low energy, that can affect your floor judges as well. So you want to make sure you keep an eye on that. Your mood can affect your head judge as well. Because you're giving all of the information from your floor judges to your head judge, or from the other team leads to your head judge, it can definitely affect the mood of your head judge, how you deliver that information. You say, hey, everything sucks out there. That's right, like that's, you don't want to do that. You're going to be like, hey, so this stuff is going on, we're working on this, these are the possible solutions, I just wanted to let you know. That's generally a better way to handle that. And can definitely affect that. And your directions to your team will be a lot cleaner. If you go into a day and you notice that you're flustered, kind of take a second, take a few breaths, try to slow everything down. Make sure that you're communicating clearly to your team. Communicating clearly is very important. This is normally the part where we do open discussion, but as we discussed, we only have 5 minutes, so we are going to not do that.
Very open discussion.
Yeah. We've been having open discussion and going along, which is great. So things to avoid, that's not my department. Nothing is ever not your department. You are a team lead on a larger team of judges. It is your role is to make sure that the event goes smoothly. Sometimes it involves doing things that are not a part of your team. If you're focusing too much on your tasks, that can hurt the event. That's not to say that you shouldn't focus on your tasks, but focusing on them too much can hurt the event, and especially focusing on them to the point where if you were to say something like that to a floor judge that comes to you with an issue, that can cause a lot of problems. You should try to help the event as much as possible. Knowing the other team's responsibilities so you know who to go to is very important in this case. So again, taking the notes and making sure that you know the responsibilities can help out with that.
I'm going to politely but firmly disagree with that's not my department. There are a large number of tasks which you should say that's something for the TO or that's something for the local police or stuff that is not related to judging where you say I am not equipped to handle this, but this person is equipped to handle this, you should see this person instead.
I agree with you in those specific cases. If we're talking about generally, just to kind of address your point, that is absolutely correct. If it's something that you're not equipped to handle, absolutely get somebody else to handle that specifically. But in this case, I'm referring to things that are relating to the event specific. Such like you're the paper team lead. Somebody comes to you with a deck list and says, "Hey, there's a problem with this deck list." You're like, "Hey, I'm the paper team lead. Let's go find the deck checks team lead, right?" Or hey, let me take a look at that list. Oh, yep, there's a problem. You should probably go talk to blah blah blah. Whoever the deck checks team lead is. Generally, if it's something that's very urgent that needs to be taken care of immediately, you should just do that and ask questions later because it's very urgent. But simply avoiding the task because it's not on your team is not something that I would recommend. It can cause conflict. We've already discussed this. Conflict can exist in many ways. But yes.
If the task that you're given is time, what can affect the turnaround time for a tournament, and you know the task that you're given is more important, then it's
not saying it's okay to say it's not my department, but it's better to defer to a different judge at that point, isn't it? For example, if you're on end of rounds, you have to deliver the last slip up so that doesn't hurt the tournament. But someone from side event wants to ask you a question, then it's probably better to not get involved at that point.
Right, I agree. So in the cases where the test that you're doing currently is more important than the test that's coming in, I wouldn't phrase it necessarily like that. Be like, hey, we're busy doing this. I would go find this person. Again, that one-step process for finding the solution. Your responsibilities to the event. I've already said that. So that is, again, making sure that you know what your responsibilities are is important, but making sure that you're taking care of the event as a whole as well is also important. There are some possible solutions. Helping whenever you can. Always help with floor coverage or the thing the head judge deems is the most important, right? But always helping with stuff like that is very important. And always notify the person that is in charge of that task. If that person is unavailable for the reason that they came to you, then you can notify the head judge as well. Okay, doing too much. So that's kind of the opposite. Instead of focusing too much on your task, doing too much, you can become unfocused from your task. There's a lot more of stuff to avoid. These slides will be available on the internet, but the things that I wanted to go through specifically were the things that you can focus on being positive, the positive generation. Those were the good qualities. I wish we had more time to go over that, but unfortunately, I do like to hear myself talk. So I just talk and talk and talk, which is great. Also, I will be here all day, not so much after the event right now, but I do have to wrap this up now. The other points are not communicating enough, just in a general sense, and not dealing with conflict. Again, thank you very much for coming to my presentation. Questions, disagreements, feedback. Again, that feedback form